So this talk is an introduction to community psychology. So for this talk, we will be defining community psychology. We will also be talking about structural change and what that means, and particularly first order versus second order change. We'll be talking about ecological levels of analysis, and you'll see what each of those entail. And we'll be talking about the core values of community psychology. So first, we need to define community psychology. So community psychology is made up of two components, right? We have the community part, and we have the psychology part. Being that psychology is an older discipline than community psychology, psychology here is sort of thought of as focused on the individual, or the influence that that individual's immediate family have on those individuals. And so generally psychology is thought of as individual behaviors of people, and understanding those individual behaviors and what influences those behaviors. Community, on the other hand, are groupings of individuals for some particular reason or for some particular goal, right? So if I live in the same neighborhood as somebody else, those people are my community. That consists of my community. Likewise, if we're talking about some shared goal or shared identity, if I'm an online game player, for example, that can also be considered a community, or a community of Facebook friends. So then the question is, what is community psychology? So community psychology is, it focuses on how community level factors or forces impact functioning of all individuals within that particular community. And additionally, it also looks at how individuals can influence a community as well. And so it's really that reciprocation between individual and community, and the understanding of how community can influence individual. So to think like a community psychologist, we have to shift the way that we think about psychology in particular and about individual behavior. And so we need to focus not only on individuals, but also we need to focus on how individuals are situated within a society or situated within a community, and how those situations are intertwined. So we need to shift our thinking from individual level, right? Shift our thinking from individual behaviors to a more ecological level, and understanding the influence between individual, community, and society. So we need to move from an individualistic perspective, focusing, again, like I said, on individual behaviors, cognitions, skills, so on and so forth, to an ecological or structural perspective. So thinking about how society, community, and individual interact. So when we think about this shift, when we think about shifting from individual to a structural perspective, the individualistic perspective, and let's take homelessness as a particular example. So let's have this sort of as our running example throughout this talk. So when we take an individualistic perspective, we look at homelessness and we say people become homeless because of some individual level of factor, right? They have mental illness, they didn't get an education, they don't have any sort of marketable skills, right? So these are individual level qualities that essentially we contribute to that person being homeless. However, if we take a structural perspective, right, we look at the influence of individual and community in that person being homeless. So taking a structural perspective would say something like, people become homeless because of the context, because there's a lack of affordable housing, because there's a lack of jobs, so therefore people don't have the monetary capacity to have a house, right? So in that case they're homeless. And so the structural perspective in community psychology is also referred to as an ecological perspective. So we're looking at the ecology, the context in which individuals are situated. So there are two sort of ways to think about these structural perspectives and how change occurs within communities, right? So we have first order change, and this is sort of closer related to the individual perspective, but it still sort of encompasses the structural perspective, or is within the structural perspective. And so first order change, it refers to altering or rearranging individual members within a group, right? Or changing the skills or the capacity of individuals within that group. So an example here would be providing job training for homeless individuals so that they could get a job and further get themselves out of homelessness, right? Second order change, on the other hand, affects relationships among community members, particularly shared goals, roles, rules, and power relationships. So in order to address the issue of homelessness in a community, taking a second order change perspective, we would do something like influence the policies around homelessness to provide more funding for affordable housing units. Or we would change the norms of how the non-homeless interact with the homeless, right? Maybe they will help them out in different ways, as opposed to sort of closing their eyes and walking away from them. So in community psychology, to understand how how communities and societies and individuals interact, we have adopted and sort of transformed this ecological model. And so Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who was a developmental psychologist, developed this model to look at the ways in which societies influence the growth of an individual, right? The development of an individual. And so community psychologists have adopted this and transformed it for our own uses. And so here's the system you see here, and we'll sort of get into each one of these. So at the center of this, right here in the middle, lies the individual. So when we're talking about individuals within this ecological system, we're talking about the skills and capacities that individuals bring to the table. So we can, if we're trying to address something like homelessness, right, we can create interventions to try to build the capacity of those individuals. So we can try to develop programs or interventions to influence individuals. The microsystem, on the other hand, and just a side note, all of us have these, right? We're all individuals. We are all part of microsystems, organizations, localities, and macrosystems. So this system is, or this ecological model, is relevant for everybody. It's not just relevant for particular people. So the macrosystem in this case are environments where people are continuously engaged with one another, right? So these are your families, these are your friends, these are small work groups. And these settings are sort of identified with informal rules, right? So within our classroom, for example, our classroom can be considered a microsystem, or the group that you work with within the classroom could be considered a microsystem. And you have particular informal rules that go with that system. Organizations, on the other hand, are similar to microsystems, but the difference here is that organizations have settings with a formal structure, right? There are formal leaders, there are formal rules, there are formal policies that are in place to create behavior within those organizations. And so they can have the power and dynamics, they have power dynamics within those institutions, within those organizations, and they have an informal culture. And additionally, as I said, with the school example, with the classroom example, organizations may host a variety of microsystems, right? So you may have friendships within an organization. So if we take UW-Bothell as our organization, for example, there are many informal microsystems within UW-Bothell. And additionally, we have localities. So localities refer to specifically geographic communities. And localities absolutely do consist of a variety of microsystems and organizations. And when we're thinking about localities, when we're thinking about geographic locations or geographic communities, history and culture of those particular localities are very important. And we'll discuss this more in detail as we go throughout the course. So when we're thinking about community psychology, we need to necessarily think about how history and culture has influenced a particular location. And then finally, microsystems. So microsystems influence all other levels of analysis. And they do this through policies, through various legislation, through social norms, etc. And one example that I like that sort of highlights how a microsystem can, how a macrosystem can influence individual behavior is standing during a national anthem. I recently had a discussion with a friend of mine who is not from the United States. So when he goes to events, he does not stand for the national anthem because it's not his country. And so he talked to me about how he would receive dirty looks from other people because he wasn't standing during the national anthem. And so you can imagine the influence that he feels to stand even though he doesn't. So that's sort of a story. That's sort of a story about how social norms can influence individual behavior. So it's really important for community psychology, so to sum up the ecological levels of analysis. Community psychologists really draw on this model, this ecological levels of analysis model, and you'll see this throughout the entire class. So become very, very familiar with this model. And it's important to us because it can show that there are multiple causes and multiple solutions to problems. And within our society and within our communities, problems are not as simplified as we often make them out to be. And so this class really utilizes this model to try to understand the multiple causes and multiple influences, as well as the multiple solutions to identifying and addressing community problems. And in addition, it describes the interactions between individuals and multiple social systems, right? And again, how individuals and those systems interact with one another to influence one another. So now to take a step in a different direction, I want to quickly go over these core values. And so community psychology has 7 core values, and I'll quickly highlight these. Just note that we will be going over each of these in more detail throughout the course. So this is just a brief overview of what each is. So first, one core value of community psychology is individual and family wellness. So in this case, wellness is the physical and psychological health that individuals have, including personal well-being and attainment of personal goals. Collective wellness, which is important to us because by now you should understand that we work within communities and in a larger context. And collective wellness is the health and wellness of communities and societies. And these are often defined by the community itself, right? So what counts as collective wellness for Detroit does not count as may not be what Seattle sees as collective wellness. Sense of community is also an important core value for us. And this refers to a perception of belongingness to a group or interdependence of group members and mutual commitment that links individuals in sort of a collective unity. So it can be the sense of community or the sense of connectedness that you may have with online game players, for example, if you're an online gamer, or the sense of belongingness you have with people on your sports team, for example. However, this may not always be positive, and this is very important to note. And one good example of this is gangs in Los Angeles. So if we think about the Bloods and the Crips, particularly back in the 1990s, they effectively lived in the same neighborhoods, right? They were all lived in South Central Los Angeles. However, because of the strong sense of community that members had within the group and the lack of sense of community they had with members outside of the group, it created this sort of insider versus outsider dynamic, and only insiders were welcome. So that's an example of how sort of sense of community can go awry, and we'll talk about this later in the quarter. Respect for human diversity. Respect for diversity is really important because, particularly for community psychologists, because it helps us understand individuals in their own particular context. And we, as community psychologists, don't encompass all diversity, right? So we don't understand fully other people's perspectives all of the time. And so this helps us to appreciate the community strengths and resources that individuals have within those communities. And it also allows us to develop and work with culturally anchored research methods, or methods that are appropriate for that particular context. And so respect for human diversity is very important because understanding diversity in the context in which people live is very important to us. Social justice, I don't know if this has been clear, but social justice is a very strong emphasis for community psychology. And social justice is about the fair and equitable allocation of resources, opportunities, and power within a society. And so there are sort of two types of social justice. There's distributive justice, which refers to the fair allocation of resources across all members of the community, right? So the fair allocation of Wi-Fi across a community, or the fair allocation of access to education within a community, right? So everybody has the equal opportunity to have access to that particular resource. Procedural justice, on the other hand, is a process of collective decision making. So ensuring that all members within a community have equal opportunity to make decisions within that community, and make decisions about that community. Empowerment and citizen participation, I personally feel that these should be two separate values, but as it is now within the community psychology framework, it is one. Empowerment refers to enhancing opportunities for people to control their own lives, both as an individual and as collectives. So you can sort of think of empowerment as the power to affect and make your own decisions, right? And affect your own life. Citizen participation, on the other hand, is a democratic decision-making process allowing all members of a community to contribute, right? So participation of citizens to make equal decisions within their own communities. And this is related to procedural justice. It's very similar to procedural justice. Collaboration and community strengths is another value. And so when we're talking about community psychology, and particularly the practice side or the practical side of community psychology, we are often working with communities that we are not a part of. And so we need to steer away from going in and saying we're the expert and we know more about certain things than you do, because the community member has his or her own lived and valued experiences within that community, and that knowledge base is really important to draw on. So it's necessary for us to collaborate instead of us being sort of the expert in a particular community. And additionally, it's important for us to draw on community strengths instead of focusing on problems. So focusing on the current strengths and resources that a community has, instead of focusing on the issues that communities need to address. And then finally, empirical grounding. Empirical grounding is essentially ensuring that community action or community change is grounded in research and having an empirical foundation to the work that we do in a community, instead of saying, well, I think this is a good idea, and moving from there, having actual evidence to support the claims that we make and having evidence to support the work that we do is very important to us. So to wrap this all up, as I mentioned before, these values are very important to community psychologists. And again, we draw on these all of the time. However, they need to be understood in relation to one another, how they complement, balance, and limit each other. And we'll read a paper later in the quarter about how diversity and sense of community oftentimes are not able to live cohesively. So that's one place where values sort of can come into conflict with one another. So we have to understand how that works. And we also need to understand that some of these values and meanings vary between individuals, communities, and contexts. So again, we need to work with communities to understand what is valued within their community and how our values can cohere with their values.